The merciless sun hammered down on Sundown Gulch's dusty town square, where a crowd of weathered men pressed around a makeshift wooden platform like buzzards circling fresh carrion. Jonah McCall stood at the crowd's edge, his calloused hands trembling as they clutched the single silver dollar in his threadbare pocket, the last coin he possessed in this world. At 28, his face bore deep lines, carved by loss and hardship, his sun-cracked skin stretched tight over prominent cheekbones. His patched shirt hung loose on his gaunt frame, testament to months of failed mining claims and meals consisting of little more than stale bread and creek water. The acrid smell of unwashed bodies and tobacco smoke filled his nostrils as he watched the horror unfold before him. On the platform stood an auctioneer with gold-capped teeth and cruel eyes, his gavel poised above a scarred wooden block. Behind him, bound with coarse hemp rope, stood a young woman whose terror radiated from every trembling muscle. Her name was Clara, though none in this lawless gathering cared to learn it. She couldn't have been more than 20, with dark hair matted against her pale face and emerald eyes that darted frantically among the leering faces below. This was no ordinary auction. In the shadow of civilization's reach, where corrupt officials turned blind eyes to human trafficking, women captured by bandits or orphaned by violence were sold like livestock to the highest bidder. The practice festered in darkness, conducted in whispered arrangements and hidden from decent folk, yet everyone knew it happened. "Gentlemen, we have here a fine specimen for your consideration." The auctioneer bellowed, his voice cracking like a whip across the square. "Young, healthy, and ready to serve in whatever capacity you require." Clara's breathing quickened, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow gasps. The torn shoulder of her once blue dress revealed bruises in the shape of cruel fingers, while dried blood crusted at the corner of her mouth. She had endured this nightmare before, bought, sold and resold like a piece of broken furniture, each transaction stripping away another layer of her humanity. "What am I bid for this lovely creature?" The auctioneer continued his hammer, tapping an impatient rhythm against the wood. A bearded man in a black hat raised his hand. $5. "7, shouted another from the back, his voice slurred with whiskey. The bidding flew back and forth while Clara's eyes squeezed shut, her lips moving in what might have been prayer or simply the mindless repetition of numbers, counting the seconds until her fate would be decided once again. Each bid felt like a nail in her coffin, each voice another link in the chain that would bind her to fresh torment. Jonah watched the spectacle with growing revulsion, his heart fracturing for the terrified woman. The memory of his own wife flashed through his mind, Mary, with her gentle auburn hair and laugh that could brighten the darkest winter day. She had been taken from him 2 years ago in a stagecoach robbery, her body never found among the burned wreckage. The official report declared all passengers dead. But Jonah's dreams were haunted by visions of Mary calling his name, her voice growing fainter with each passing night. $10, called out a man with a scarred face and missing fingers. The bidding slowed as the price climbed. $10 represented a week's wages for most of these men, and whispered rumors had been circulating that Clara brought misfortune to her owners. Previous buyers had supposedly suffered mysterious accidents, financial ruin, and worse. The stories were actually planted by Pike Morrison's gang to drive down her value for a quick sale. But superstition ran deeper than greed in these parts. Jonah felt something stir within him, a spark of the man he had been before grief hollowed him out. With his heart hammering against his ribs, he stepped forward from the crowd's edge. $1? He said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the sudden silence. The crowd erupted in harsh laughter. Men slapped their knees and pointed at the shabby miner who dared bid a single dollar on human flesh, worth 10 times that amount. The sound cut through Jonah like broken glass, but he held his ground. $1. The auctioneer laughed, his gold teeth glinting in the afternoon sun. "Sir, this is a serious auction, not a charity bazaar. It's all I have." Jonah replied louder this time. He pulled the silver coin from his pocket and held it up where everyone could see the metal catching the light. "But I'll treat her with respect and kindness, which is more than I can say for the rest of you." The laughter died away as the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Several men looked down at their boots, suddenly aware of how their intentions might appear to others. The auctioneers scanned the faces for higher bids, but the combination of superstition and shame had effectively silenced the gathering. "Going once?" the auctioneer said reluctantly, his voice lacking its earlier enthusiasm. "Going twice." He paused, searching the crowd one final time. "Sold to the miner for $1. As Jonah stepped forward to claim Clara, he had no idea that this single act of compassion would drag him into a web of conspiracy and violence that would test every fiber of his being. The silver dollar felt warm in his palm as he handed it over, sealing a bargain that would change 3 lives forever. Set up 2 years and 4 months earlier, Jonah McCall had been a different man entirely. He owned a profitable mining claim in the rocky hills outside Sundown Gulch, employed 3 hard-working men, and lived in a comfortable log cabin with his beloved wife, Mary. She was 26 years old, the same age as Jonah, with auburn hair that caught fire in the morning sunlight and a musical laugh that could lift his spirits even after the most backbreaking days in the mine. Their home sat on a small rise overlooking the valley with a vegetable garden that Mary tended with loving care, and a front porch where they would sit in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. They had been married for 4 years, and while children had not yet blessed their union, they spoke often of the family they would raise in this wild but beautiful land. Mary wore a special silver locket that Jonah had commissioned from the town's most skilled silversmith as a wedding gift. The piece was unique, engraved with their initials JM and MM, intertwined in an intricate Celtic pattern that spoke of eternal love, with a small ruby embedded in the center like a drop of blood. Inside, a tiny photograph showed them on their wedding day, and a lock of Jonah's dark hair rested beside it. No other locket like it existed in the entire territory, making it unmistakably hers. Their world shattered on a Tuesday morning in September, when Mary decided to visit her sister in the neighboring town of Cedar Falls. The weekly stagecoach would carry her the 40 miles through mountain passes and desert flats, a journey that should have taken less than 2 days. She kissed Jonah goodbye at the depot wearing her favorite blue shawl with her initials embroidered in silk thread, carrying only a small carpet bag and the promise to return by Friday evening. The stagecoach never reached Cedar Falls. On a lonely stretch of road where the trail wound through Devil's Canyon, masked bandits led by the notorious outlaw Pike Morrison struck with military precision. The official report stated that all 7 passengers and the driver were killed and their bodies burned beyond recognition when the overturned coach caught fire. The bandits had made off with the mail strongbox passenger belongings and anything else of value, leaving only charred wood and scattered bones. Jonah refused to accept Mary's death without seeing proof. He spent 3 weeks searching the attack site, following every lead and questioning every witness. The burned coach yielded nothing but ash and melted metal. He hired Apache trackers who could follow a trail days old, consulted with territorial lawmen, and even posted reward notices offering money he didn't have for information about survivors. But no trace of Mary's body was ever found, and the local sheriff eventually declared the case closed. The burned stagecoach and scattered personal effects were all that remained of 7 lives, and the investigation was filed away, with dozens of other unsolved crimes that plagued the lawless frontier. The loss devastated Jonah completely. He stopped working his mining claim, letting his 3 employees go and allowing the once profitable operation to collapse into abandoned shafts and rusted equipment. He spent his life savings on the futile search for Mary, then gambled away more money in darkened saloons while trying to numb the pain with rot-gut whiskey that burned his throat and offered no relief. His friends and neighbors tried to help, bringing food and offering work, but Jonah pushed them away, with the desperate fury of a wounded animal. He spoke constantly of Mary, as if she were still alive, insisting that she would return any day, now that the reports of her death were mistaken. People began to avoid him, uncomfortable with his wild eyes and rambling talk of dreams where Mary called his name. Within 18 months, Jonah had lost everything. The mining claim was sold to pay mounting debts, the comfortable cabin was repossessed by the bank, and he found himself living in a one-room shack on the outskirts of town. He survived on odd jobs, mucking out stables, hauling freight, and panning for gold in streams that had been played out for years. The townspeople pitied him, but kept their distance, treating him like a ghost haunting the edges of their community. The silver locket consumed his thoughts during the long, sleepless nights. He knew Pike's gang had taken it along with Mary's other possessions, but he couldn't stop imagining it in the hands of those killers being sold in some distant town or traded for supplies. Sometimes he would wake from dreams where he could see Mary's face, her lips moving as she tried to tell him something important, only to find himself alone in the darkness with tears on his cheeks. This was the broken man who stood in the town square that day, clutching his last dollar and driven by a desperate need to save someone else's wife or daughter from the fate he couldn't prevent for Mary. He had no idea that this single act of compassion would lead him back to the truth about the woman he loved, or that the truth would be far more terrible than anything he had imagined. Inciting incident. After the auction concluded and the crowd dispersed, Jonah approached Clara with careful, measured steps. She remained frozen on the platform, her bound hands trembling, as she watched him with wide eyes that held more fear than hope. The auctioneer had already pocketed the silver dollar and disappeared into the crowd, leaving them alone in the fading afternoon light. "My name is Jonah McCall," he said softly, stopping a respectful distance away. "I want you to know that I didn't buy you to own you. I bought you to free you." Clara's lower lip trembled, but she didn't speak. She had heard such promises before, only to discover they were lies designed to make her compliant. Her green eyes studied his face, searching for the telltale signs of cruelty that she had learned to recognize in men's expressions. Jonah reached into his weathered saddlebags and pulled out a dented canteen of water and a piece of jerky wrapped in brown paper. "You must be hungry and thirsty," he said, setting them on the platform within her reach. "These are yours." He then produced a small knife with a bone handle, its blade worn smooth by years of use. "I'm going to cut your bonds now. Please don't run. I only want to help you." As he sawed through the coarse hemp rope around her wrists, Clara began to cry. The tears came slowly at first, then in great racking sobs that shook her entire body. The rope had chafed her skin raw, leaving angry red welts that would take days to heal. "You don't understand," she whispered between sobs. "I don't deserve your kindness. I'm cursed. Everyone who tries to help me ends up dead or worse." "That's nonsense," Jonah said firmly, finishing with the ropes and stepping back to give her space. "No one deserves to be treated like property. Whatever happened to you before, it wasn't your fault." Clara rubbed her freed wrists, still crying. "You don't know what I've done. The things I've had to do to survive. I'm not the innocent girl you think I am." "I don't care about your past," Jonah replied. "All I care about is making sure you're safe now. Do you have anywhere to go, family, friends?" Clara shook her head, her dark hair falling across her face. "They're all dead. Pike's gang killed them 3 years ago." She reached for the water canteen with shaking hands, then paused as her free hand moved instinctively to her throat, where something glinted beneath the torn fabric of her dress. "Pike Morrison." Jonah's voice sharpened like a blade. "The outlaw who leads the gang that's been terrorizing the territory." Clara nodded, then suddenly the thin chain around her neck snapped under the pressure of her nervous fingers. A silver locket fell from beneath her dress and landed in the dust at Jonah's feet, catching the afternoon sunlight like a fallen star. Time seemed to stop. Jonah stared at the locket, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his temples. He knew that piece of jewelry as intimately as he knew his own face. The intricate Celtic pattern and the intertwined initials, the small ruby in the center, it was impossible to mistake. With trembling hands, he picked up the locket and opened it with the practiced ease of someone who had done this action thousands of times. Inside was the tiny photograph of himself and Mary on their wedding day. And beside it, the lock of his dark hair, exactly as he had placed them 4 years ago. "Where did you get this?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the distant sound of horses and conversation from the street. Clara looked down at the locket in his hands, and fresh tears began to fall. "Pike gave it to me," she said, her voice breaking. "He said it was a gift, but I know he stole it from someone. He gives all the women he keeps. Stolen jewelry to mock the people he's killed." Jonah's grief transformed into a burning rage that threatened to consume him from within. His hands shook as he held the locket, feeling the weight of Mary's memory and the heat of his own fury. "This belonged to my wife," he said through gritted teeth. "She was wearing it when she died in the stagecoach robbery 2 years ago. Pike's gang killed her." "I'm sorry," Clara sobbed, backing away from him. "I didn't know. I'll never touch it again, I promise. Please don't hurt me." But Jonah wasn't angry with Clara. His fury was directed entirely at Pike Morrison and the man who had not only murdered his wife, but was now using her memory to torment innocent victims. Holding the locket in his palm, Jonah felt something he hadn't experienced in 2 years, a sense of purpose that cut through the fog of grief and despair. "Tell me everything you know about Pike," he said, his voice deadly calm. "Where he is, how many men he has, what his routines are. Everything." Clara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, studying his face with new interest. "You want to go after him, but he's the most dangerous man in the territory. He has at least 25 men, maybe more, and they're all killers. He controls everything north of the Badlands. I don't care if he has 100 men." Jonah replied carefully, placing the locket in his shirt pocket next to his heart. "He took everything from me. Now I'm going to take everything from him." For the first time since the auction, Clara's eyes showed something other than fear. She saw determination in Jonah's weathered face, a strength that had been missing from her life for so long that she had almost forgotten what it looked like. "If you're really going after Pike," she said quietly, "then I want to help you. He destroyed my life too. I know where he keeps his camps, how he moves his men, what his weaknesses are." Jonah studied her face, seeing the resolve beneath the tears and trauma. "It will be dangerous. We might not survive. I'm already dead." Clara replied, her voice growing stronger. "I have been for 3 years. At least this way I might be able to die for something meaningful." As they shook hands in the dusty town square, neither of them realized that their quest for justice would lead them into a conspiracy far more complex and dangerous than simple banditry. The silver locket had connected them through shared loss, but it would take all their courage and cunning to survive what lay ahead. First obstacle. The next morning, Jonah liquidated his meager remaining possessions, a worn leather saddle, a rusty pickaxe that had once been his livelihood, and his last pair of decent boots to a suspicious merchant who paid him far less than they were worth. With the small amount of money, he purchased ammunition for his old Navy Colt revolver, strips of dried beef hardtack that could crack teeth, and a tired horse from the livery stable that looked as weathered as its new owner. Clara waited for him at the edge of town, having spent the night hidden in an abandoned barn to avoid the men who might try to reclaim their property. She had changed from her torn dress into men's clothing borrowed from a washing line, rough canvas pants, a cotton shirt that hung loose on her small frame, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast shadows across her face. The transformation made her look younger and more vulnerable, but also more determined. Pike's main stronghold is about 3 days' ride north through the Badlands. Clara explained as they headed out of town on the narrow trail that wound through sagebrush and scattered rocks. But he has smaller camps throughout the territory. The closest one is in Devil's Canyon, about a day's ride from here. If we can find evidence there, maybe we can learn more about what happened to your wife. Jonah gripped the reins tighter, feeling the familiar weight of the locket against his chest. Tell me about Pike. What kind of man is he? Clara was quiet for a long moment, her face darkening with painful memories. The only sound was the steady clip-clop of their horses' hooves on the hard-packed earth and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. He's not just violent, she said finally. He's calculating. He enjoys causing pain, especially to women, but he's not a mindless brute. He plans everything carefully, always thinking several steps ahead. He keeps trophies from his victims, things that meant something to them. Jewelry, clothing, personal items. He forces the women he traffics to wear them, knowing it hurts the survivors to see their loved ones' possessions on strangers. How long were you with him? 3 years. Clara replied, her voice barely above a whisper. He killed my parents when I was 17. They were traveling to California to start a new life when Pike's gang attacked their wagon train. He kept me alive because... She paused, unable to finish the sentence. Jonah felt a surge of protectiveness toward Clara, mixed with his burning hatred for Pike. Why didn't you try to escape? I did many times during the first year. But Pike always found me, and the punishment was always worse than the captivity. He has men everywhere in towns, on ranches, even some wearing badges. Eventually, I stopped trying. I told myself I was just surviving, but really I was dying inside a little more each day. They rode in companionable silence for several hours, following a winding trail through increasingly harsh terrain. The landscape was unforgiving: little water, less shade, and rocks that could lame a horse or break a man's leg. Jonah began to understand why Pike had chosen this territory for his operations. It was a natural fortress, where lawmen rarely ventured and supplies were scarce. As the sun reached its zenith, Clara suddenly pulled her horse to a stop. "We're being followed," she said urgently, her voice tight with fear. 3 riders about a mile behind us. They've been keeping pace with us for the last hour. Jonah looked back and saw the distant figures on horseback, their forms wavering in the heat haze. Men from the auction, most likely. They want me back so they can sell me to someone who'll pay a proper price. We need to reach the canyon before they catch up. They spurred their horses forward, but the pursuing riders were gaining ground. Jonah's old horse was tired from the long ride, and Clara's mount wasn't much better. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder behind them as they entered the mouth of Devil's Canyon, where red rock walls rose on either side like the ribs of some ancient beast. There. Clara pointed to a cluster of massive boulders ahead. We can make a stand there. They reached the rocks, just as the first gunshot cracked across the canyon. The bullet struck stone inches from Jonah's head, sending up a shower of red dust and rock fragments. He dove from his horse, pulling Clara down with him as more shots rang out. "Stay down," he told her, drawing his Navy Colt and checking its cylinder. 6 shots, he would have to make them count. One of the pursuers had dismounted and was working his way closer, using the canyon walls for cover. The man appeared suddenly around a rock, outcropping his rifle aimed directly at Jonah's chest. "Drop your weapon, miner," he called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "We don't want to kill you. We just want the girl." Instead of surrendering, Jonah dove to the side as the rifle fired. The bullet grazed his shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the jagged rocks. Pain shot through his arm like liquid fire, but he managed to keep hold of his revolver. The gunman advanced confidently, certain that Jonah was out of the fight. He didn't see Clara creeping up behind him with a sharp piece of broken glass she had found among the rocks, her movement silent as a hunting cat. As the man raised his rifle for the killing shot, Clara struck, driving the glass deep into his back. The gunman screamed and fell forward, dropping his rifle. Clara grabbed the weapon and tossed it to Jonah, then helped him to his feet. Blood seeped through his shirt, but the wound wasn't serious, more of a deep scratch than a true injury. "Can you ride?" she asked urgently, glancing toward the canyon mouth where the other two pursuers would soon appear. "I'll have to," Jonah replied, pressing his hand to his bleeding shoulder. "They'll be here any moment." They mounted their horses and rode deeper into the canyon, following a trail that Clara remembered from her time as Pike's prisoner. Behind them, angry shouts echoed off the canyon walls as the remaining pursuers found their wounded companion. As they climbed higher into the rocky maze, Jonah looked at Clara with new respect. She had saved his life without hesitation, proving that beneath her fear and trauma was a core of steel that hadn't been broken by 3 years of abuse. "Thank you," he said simply. "We're partners now," Clara replied. "We watch each other's backs." By evening, they had reached the ruins of an old cabin that Clara identified as one of Pike's abandoned hideouts. The structure was partially collapsed with scorch marks on the walls and bullet holes in the remaining timbers. It had clearly been the site of a violent confrontation, though whether between Pike's men and lawmen or rival outlaw gangs was impossible to determine. They searched the ruins by moonlight, looking for any clues about Pike's current operations. In what remained of the cabin's back room, half buried under charred debris, Jonah found something that made his blood run cold. It was a woman's blue shawl stained with dried blood and bearing the embroidered initials MM in one corner. The silk thread had partially unraveled, but the letters were still clearly visible. It was Mary's shawl, the one she had been wearing when she boarded the stagecoach 2 years ago. "Clara," he called out, his voice shaking, "you need to see this." She hurried over and examined the shawl, her face going pale as she recognized it. "This is from the stagecoach robbery," she said quietly. "Pike keeps trophies from all his victims. But if this is here, it means Mary might not be dead." Jonah finished, his heart racing with sudden hope. If Pike kept her belongings as trophies, maybe he kept her alive too. Clara looked at him with pity and concern. "Jonah, I've been with Pike for 3 years. I've seen all his prisoners, all his victims. I never saw your wife, but you said he has multiple camps," Jonah pressed. "Maybe he keeps different prisoners in different locations. Maybe she's still alive somewhere." Clara wanted to give him hope, but she also knew Pike's methods. Even if she survived the initial attack that was 2 years ago, Pike doesn't usually keep prisoners that long unless they're particularly useful to him. But Jonah refused to give up. Holding Mary's blood-stained shawl, he made a silent vow that he would find Pike Morrison and learn the truth about his wife's fate, no matter what it cost him. The locket around his neck and the shawl in his hands were all he had left of the woman he loved, and he would follow them wherever they led. Rising action. The next morning, Jonah and Clara continued their journey toward Pike's main stronghold, following a treacherous trail through the Badlands that tested both their horses and their resolve. The landscape grew increasingly hostile, with each mile jagged rocks that could slice through leather-hidden ravines that could swallow a horse and rider, and rattlesnakes that struck without warning from the shadows of sagebrush. As they rode, Clara shared more details about Pike's operation, her voice growing harder with each revelation. "He's not just a robber," she explained, adjusting her hat against the blazing sun. "He runs a network that spans the entire territory. Stagecoach holdups, cattle rustling, kidnapping for ransom, even murder for hire. He controls it all from his mountain fortress." "How many men does he have?" "It changes depending on the season and the jobs he's planning, but usually around 25 to 30 at the main camp. They're not ordinary bandits, they're the worst kind of criminals. Killers, rapists, men who've been kicked out of other gangs for being too violent. Pike recruits them because they're loyal to him out of fear." Jonah absorbed this information grimly. He was one man with an old revolver and limited ammunition, preparing to face a small army of professional killers. The odds were hopeless, but the image of Mary's blood-stained shawl drove him forward like a spur to a horse's flanks. They stopped at a muddy waterhole to rest their horses and refill their canteens. Clara washed her face in the brackish water, then sat on a flat rock to examine a cut on her foot where her borrowed boots had rubbed the skin raw. "There's something else you should know about Pike," she said reluctantly, not meeting his eyes. "He's not just cruel, he's intelligent. He plans everything carefully, always thinking 3 steps ahead. The auction where you bought me wasn't random. He arranged it." "What do you mean?" "The rumors about me being cursed weren't accidents. Pike's men spread those stories to drive down my price. He wanted me to be sold cheaply to someone desperate, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions. Then he could track down the buyer and—" She trailed off, unable to finish. Jonah felt a chill of realization. "He's been using you as bait." "Exactly. And now he's using you too. He knows we're coming. He's probably known since the moment you bid on me." As if summoned by her words, a rifle shot cracked across the waterhole. The bullet struck the rock where Clara had been sitting, sending up a shower of stone fragments. She dove for cover behind a larger boulder as more shots rang out from the hills above them. "It's Pike's men," Clara called out, her voice tight with fear. "They found us." Jonah counted at least 6 muzzle flashes on the ridgeline above them, the positions carefully chosen to create a killing field around the waterhole. They were surrounded with no way to retreat except back the way they had come, and that route was probably blocked by now. "We have to reach those rocks," Jonah said, pointing to a cluster of boulders about 50 yards away. "It's our only chance for decent cover." They ran in a zigzag pattern as bullets whined around them like angry hornets. The distance seemed impossibly far, each step taking them deeper into the crossfire. Clara stumbled and fell with a cry of pain, blood spreading across her trouser leg where a bullet had grazed her thigh. "I can't run." She gasped, her face pale with shock and pain. "Leave me here. Save yourself." Not a chance," Jonah replied, helping her to her feet. He half-carried her the remaining distance to the rock's bullets striking the ground around them with each labored step. One shot came so close that he felt the heat of the bullet pass his ear. From their new position, they could see the attackers moving down the hillside with professional efficiency. These weren't the same men who had chased them from the auction, and these were Pike's regulars, well-armed and experienced in the art of killing. "There's a cave about 100 yards behind us," Clara said, pointing to a dark opening in the canyon wall. "If we can reach it, we might be able to hold them off." The cave was their only hope, but reaching it would require crossing open ground under fire from multiple directions. Jonah checked his ammunition, only 12 bullets left in his belt, plus the 6 in his revolver. Against 6 men, those wouldn't last long. "When I start shooting, you run for the cave," he told Clara. "Don't stop, don't look back, just run." "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you." Jonah stepped out from behind the rocks and opened fire, his Navy Colt bucking in his hand. His first shot dropped one of the attackers, but the others quickly took cover and returned fire with renewed intensity. Clara ran for the cave, limping badly, but moving as fast as her wounded leg would allow. A bullet tugged at Jonah's hat as he emptied his cylinder, then reloaded with his remaining 6 bullets. He had bought Clara enough time to reach the cave, but now he had to cover the same distance with armed men closing in from 3 sides. He made it halfway before a bullet caught him in the left leg, just below the knee. The impact sent him tumbling to the ground, his revolver spinning away across the rocks. Pain shot through his body like lightning, but he forced himself to crawl toward the cave as boots pounded on stone behind him. The attackers reached him just as he grasped his fallen weapon. They kicked it away and hauled him to his feet, rough hands binding his wrists with practiced efficiency. Blood seeped through his pants leg, but the wound wasn't life-threatening. Pike's men were skilled at inflicting pain without causing death. "Come out, girl," the leader shouted toward the cave, "or we'll kill your friend right here." Clara emerged from the cave with her hands raised, tears streaming down her face. "Please don't hurt him," she pleaded. "I'll come quietly." The leader smiled coldly. "You're both coming with us. Pike has special plans for you." As they were loaded onto horses for the ride to Pike's stronghold, Jonah caught Clara's eye. Despite their capture, he saw something in her expression that gave him hope. She had a plan, he realized. Even in defeat, she was still fighting. The ride to Pike's main camp took them deeper into the mountains, following trails that were barely visible to the untrained eye. They passed through narrow defiles guarded by hidden sentries, then climbed switchback paths that would be impossible to navigate without a guide. The higher they climbed, the more fortress-like the terrain became. Pike's stronghold was built into a natural bowl in the mountains, surrounded by sheer walls of stone, and defended by strategically placed rifle positions. It was a fortress that could hold off a small army, supplied by hidden springs and stocked with enough provisions to withstand a siege. As they entered the compound, Jonah saw the full scope of Pike's operation. There were barracks for the men's stables, for horses, workshops for repairing weapons and equipment, and several buildings that looked disturbingly like prisons. This wasn't just a hideout, it was a permanent military installation designed for long-term operations. And somewhere in this fortress, if Clara was right, there might be answers about what really happened to Mary McCall. Midpoint twist. Pike Morrison stood waiting for them in the center of the compound, a commanding figure who radiated authority and barely contained violence. He was tall and lean, with graying hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to look straight through a person's soul. His black leather vest was tailored and expensive, worn over a white shirt that was cleaner than anything Jonah had seen in months. 2 matching Colt revolvers hung from his gun belt, and their ivory grips polished to a mirror shine. "Well, well," Pike said as Jonah and Clara were dragged before him, his voice cultured and precise. "The famous Jonah McCall come to visit me at last. I've been expecting you for quite some time." "You know who I am?" Jonah asked, surprised by the revelation. "Of course I know who you are. I've been watching you for 2 years, waiting for the right moment to complete my collection." Pike walked in a slow circle around them, like a predator sizing up wounded prey. "You see, I don't rob and kill randomly like some common brigand. I study my victims, learn their weaknesses, their desires, their deepest fears. I knew that someday you would come looking for answers about your dear wife, Mary." Jonah's heart skipped a beat at the mention of Mary's name. "What do you know about Mary?" Pike's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too white and too perfect. "I know everything about Mary McCall. Would you like to see her?" Before Jonah could respond, Pike gestured to his men. They disappeared into one of the buildings and returned a moment later, half carrying a woman between them. She was thin and dirty, her hair matted, and her clothes little more than rags. But for a heart-stopping moment, Jonah thought he recognized her. "Mary," he shouted, struggling against his bonds with desperate strength. But as the woman was brought closer, Jonah saw that it wasn't Mary at all. It was another woman, perhaps the same age and build, but with different features and different eyes. She looked up at him with confusion and fear, clearly having no idea who he was or why he was calling out to her. Pike laughed at Jonah's expression, a sound like breaking glass. "Did you really think I would keep your wife alive all this time? Mary McCall died 2 years ago in that stagecoach, just like the official report said. But I kept her belongings as trophies, and I've been using them to torment you ever since." "You're lying," Jonah said, but doubt was creeping into his voice like poison. "Am I? Tell me, Jonah, how did you find Clara? Was it really just luck that you happened to be at that auction with your last dollar, or did someone make sure you heard about it?" The truth hit Jonah like a physical blow. Every event of the past few days suddenly took on a different meaning. You arranged the auction. You wanted me to buy Clara. Exactly. I needed a way to draw you out of town, away from witnesses and law enforcement. Clara was the perfect bait, wearing your wife's locket, carrying your wife's scent on her clothes. I knew you wouldn't be able to resist trying to save her. Clara looked at Jonah with horror and shame. I didn't know, she whispered. I swear I didn't know he was using me to trap you. Of course you didn't, Pike said mockingly. You're too simple to understand the bigger picture. You've been my puppet for 3 years, dancing to my strings without even realizing it. He walked over to a heavy wooden chest that sat near his personal tent and opened it slowly, savoring the moment. Inside were dozens of personal items, jewelry, clothing, photographs, letters, all arranged with the care of a museum curator. Each piece told a story of someone destroyed a life, ended or ruined for Pike's profit and pleasure. This is my collection. Pike explained, his voice taking on an almost reverent tone. Each piece represents not just a successful operation, but a work of art. The art of destruction. Your wife's locket is one of my favorite pieces because it represents not just her death, but your prolonged suffering. Pike pulled out Mary's familiar blue shawl and held it up to the light, examining it like a precious artifact. This belonged to Mary too. She was wearing it when my men stopped the stagecoach. She begged for her life, offered me everything she had promised to do, anything I wanted. But I killed her anyway, just for the pleasure of watching hope die in her eyes. Jonah felt something break inside him, not just his heart, but his very soul. The grief and rage that had been building for 2 years exploded in a primal scream that echoed off the canyon walls. He lunged forward, trying to reach Pike despite his bonds, but the outlaw's men held him back with practiced ease. There's more, Pike continued, clearly enjoying Jonah's pain. After I killed your wife, I had my men arrange the scene to look like a robbery gone wrong. We burned the stagecoach and scattered the other bodies to cover our tracks. But I kept Mary's body separate for a while. Would you like to know what I did with it? Stop, Clara said quietly, tears streaming down her face. Please just stop. But Pike was just getting started. He reached into the chest again and pulled out a small wooden box, handling it with the care of a man holding something precious. I had one of my men, who used to be a photographer, take pictures of Mary's body before we disposed of it. Would you like to see how beautiful she looked in her final moments? Jonah stopped struggling and looked at Pike with deadly calm. You're going to die, he said simply. I don't know how, I don't know when, but I'm going to kill you. Many men have made that threat. Pike replied, unperturbed. They're all dead now, and you'll join them soon enough. But first, I want you to understand something important. This isn't just about money or power. This is about artistry, the art of complete destruction. He gestured to the buildings around them, his voice taking on the tone of a lecturer addressing students. I don't just kill people, I destroy their souls first. I take away everything they love, everything they believe in, everything that makes them human. Then when they're broken and helpless, I grant them the mercy of death. Clara was shaking now, finally understanding the full scope of Pike's evil. You're insane, she whispered. No. Pike corrected, his eyes gleaming with fanatic fervor. I'm enlightened. I've moved beyond the simple motivations of ordinary criminals. I've achieved a kind of purity in my purpose. And now I'm going to share that purity with both of you. He nodded to his men, who began dragging Jonah and Clara toward the prison buildings. But as they moved, Clara caught Jonah's eye and mouthed a single word. Wait. During Pike's monologue, she had noticed something that he had missed in his arrogance. The wooden chest was still open, and she could see papers inside, documents that might contain information about Pike's entire operation. If they could somehow escape and reach those papers, they might be able to expose his network to the authorities. But first, they had to survive whatever Pike had planned for them. And based on the cruel anticipation in his eyes as they were dragged away, survival was going to require more than just courage. It was going to require a miracle. Second obstacle. The prison building was a monument to human cruelty carved into the living rock of the mountain like a wound in the earth itself. Individual cells were little more than caves with iron bars, each one designed to hold a single prisoner in complete isolation. The air was thick with the smell of human waste and despair, while the walls were covered with scratches made by previous inmates trying to count the days of their captivity or simply maintain their sanity through repetitive motion. They threw Jonah into a cell barely large enough for him to lie down, his wounded leg throbbing with each movement. Clara was dragged to a different section of the building, her limping footsteps echoing through the tunnels until they faded into silence. As the guards walked away, their torches casting dancing shadows on the walls, Pike's voice echoed through the passages like the whisper of a demon. "Let them think about what's coming." He called out, his words bouncing off the stone walls. "Tomorrow will begin the real entertainment." Jonah spent the night working at his bonds, trying to loosen the ropes that held his wrists. The hemp was tied by experts who knew their craft, each knot designed to tighten under pressure. His wounded leg had stiffened during the ride, and his shoulder still bled from the bullet graze. But physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional torment of learning the truth about Mary's fate. Pike's words echoed in his mind like a curse. "She begged for her life, offered me everything she had promised to do, anything I wanted. But I killed her anyway, just for the pleasure of watching hope die in her eyes." The image of Mary's final moments was burned into Jonah's brain, and he knew it would haunt him for whatever time he had left. At dawn, the guards returned 3 men with faces that spoke of violence and cruelty, as casual as breathing. They dragged Jonah from his cell and brought him to a large chamber that had been carved out of the mountain's interior. The room was filled with devices that made his blood run cold, racks, branding irons, whips, and instruments of torture that he couldn't identify, but that spoke of pain refined into an art form. Pike stood in the center of the chamber, now wearing a leather apron over his fine clothes. "Welcome to my workshop," he said cheerfully, like a craftsman showing off his tools. "This is where I practice my art. Over the years, I've learned that physical pain is just the beginning. The real breakthrough comes when you can break a person's spirit, when you can make them beg for the very thing they once feared most." Clara was brought in next, but she had been transformed in a way that made Jonah's heart stop. She had been cleaned and dressed in a white dress that he recognized as similar to the one Mary had worn in their wedding photograph. Her hair had been styled to match Mary's, and around her neck hung the silver locket, his wedding gift to his wife. "You see," Pike continued, clearly pleased with his handiwork, "I've been planning this moment for 2 years. Every detail has been carefully considered. Clara is wearing clothes that belong to your wife. The locket around her neck is the same one you gave Mary on your wedding day. Even her hair has been styled to match the photograph I took from Mary's belongings." Jonah realized with horror what Pike was planning. "You're going to make me watch you kill her dressed as Mary? Oh, it's much more sophisticated than that," Pike said with obvious pride. "I'm going to give you a choice. You can watch me torture Clara to death slowly over the course of several days, knowing that she's suffering because of your actions. Or you can kill her yourself quickly and painlessly to spare her that suffering." The chamber fell silent, except for the sound of water dripping somewhere in the darkness. Clara met Jonah's eyes across the room, and despite everything, her voice was steady when she spoke. "Don't do it," she said firmly. "Whatever he offers you, don't take it. He's trying to break you the same way he broke me." Pike walked over to a table covered with sharp instruments, each one gleaming with recent care. "The beauty of this approach is that there's no right answer. If you kill Clara, you'll spend the rest of your life knowing that you murdered an innocent woman. If you don't kill her, you'll spend the rest of your life knowing that you could have spared her immense suffering." He picked up a long knife and tested its edge against his thumb, drawing a thin line of blood. Either way, your soul will be destroyed. You'll die knowing that you failed the woman you loved and the woman who tried to help you. Jonah looked around the chamber, searching for any possible escape route. The walls were solid rock, the ceiling too high to reach, and the single doorway was guarded by 3 armed men. There was no way out, no cavalry coming to the rescue, no last-minute salvation. I need time to think, Jonah said, hoping to delay the inevitable. Of course, Pike replied reasonably. I'm not an unreasonable man. You have until sunset to make your decision. That gives you plenty of time to consider all the possibilities and their consequences. They dragged Jonah and Clara back to their separate cells, leaving them alone with their thoughts and the constant drip of water that marked the passage of time. Through the prison walls, Jonah could hear other prisoners, some crying, some praying, some simply screaming in madness. This was Pike's true legacy, a mountain full of broken souls, each one a testament to his talent for destruction. As the day wore on, Jonah found himself thinking not about escape, but about acceptance. Maybe Pike was right. Maybe some evil was too powerful to overcome by ordinary means. Maybe the best a man could do was choose the manner of his defeat. But then he heard Clara's voice singing softly in the darkness. It was a hymn he remembered from his childhood, one his mother used to sing when thunderstorms frightened him. The words spoke of hope in the darkness of faith, in the face of despair of love, that could overcome even death itself. As Clara's voice echoed through the prison, other inmates began to join in. Soon the entire building was filled with the sound of broken voices raised in song, creating something beautiful from their collective pain. It was a sound that spoke of humanity's refusal to surrender, even in the face of ultimate evil. Pike's men tried to stop the singing, threatening the prisoners with beatings and worse. But the voices continued growing stronger with each verse. For the first time in years, the mountain stronghold was filled with something other than screams and curses. Jonah realized that Clara was sending him a message. She was telling him that no matter what Pike did to their bodies, he couldn't touch their souls unless they let him. The singing was an act of defiance, a declaration that hope could survive, even in hell. As sunset approached, Jonah made his decision. He wouldn't play Pike's game. He wouldn't choose between 2 kinds of defeat. Instead, he would find a third option, even if it meant dying in the attempt. When the guards came for him, Jonah was ready to fight. Climax. The storm hit Pike's stronghold like the wrath of God, transforming the mountain fortress into a chaos of wind, rain, and lightning. Thunder crashed overhead with such force that it shook dust from the ceiling of the torture chamber, while sheets of rain turned the compound's dirt paths into rivers of mud. The timing couldn't have been more perfect or more dangerous. Pike stood in the center of the chamber, his torture implements laid out on the table with surgical precision. Clara had been chained to a thick wooden post, still wearing Mary's white dress, her hair still styled to match the wedding photograph. The silver locket caught the torchlight as she breathed each rise and fall of her chest, a reminder of what Jonah had lost. "Have you made your decision?" Pike asked, raising his voice above the sound of the storm. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the chamber in stark white light for a brief moment, before plunging it back into dancing shadows. "I have," Jonah replied, his voice steady despite the pain in his leg and the bonds around his wrists. "I choose to kill you instead." Pike laughed, the sound mixing with the thunder outside. "With what your hands are bound, you have no weapons, and you're surrounded by my men. You're in no position to make threats. Maybe not." Jonah set his eyes meeting Clara's across the chamber. "But I'm not going to make your choice easy." As if summoned by his words, lightning struck somewhere close to the compound. The entire mountain seemed to shake, and for a brief moment the chamber was plunged into darkness as the torches flickered. In that instant of confusion, Clara acted. She had been working at her chains throughout the day, using a sharp piece of metal she had found embedded in the wooden post. The metal had cut her fingers, but she had managed to weaken one of the links. Now, as the thunder crashed overhead, the chain broke free. Clara lunged toward the table of torture instruments, but Pike's men moved to intercept her. Jonah threw himself into their path despite his bound hands using his body as a weapon. He couldn't fight effectively, but he could create enough chaos to give Clara the seconds she needed. She grabbed a long knife from the table and spun around the blade, catching the torchlight. With one swift motion, she cut Jonah's bonds, freeing his hands for the first time in hours. Blood rushed back into his fingers, bringing with it both relief and the painful tingle of returning circulation. "The door!" Clara shouted, pointing to the chamber's entrance, where one of the guards was raising his rifle. They ran together through the underground tunnels, Pike's curses echoing behind them like the howls of a wounded animal. The storm had created perfect cover for their escape. The guards couldn't see clearly in the flickering torchlight, and the thunder masked the sound of their footsteps on the stone floor. But Pike knew these tunnels better than they did. He had spent years expanding and improving his fortress, memorizing every passage and secret route. Now he used that knowledge against them, taking a shortcut through a narrow passage they didn't know existed. He emerged ahead of them in a natural cavern deep inside the mountain, blocking their path to the surface with a revolver in each hand. His fine clothes were disheveled, his hair wild, and his eyes blazed with a fury that transformed his face into something inhuman. "Did you really think it would be that easy?" He snarled, his voice echoing off the cavern walls. "I've been planning this for 2 years. Every possible escape route has been considered and sealed." The three of them stood in the underground chamber with no way out except through Pike. Water dripped from the ceiling each drop, echoing like a gunshot in the tense silence. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur from an underground spring, and the walls glistened with moisture that reflected the torchlight like 1,000 watching eyes. "Now this is where it ends," Pike said, raising his weapons. "But before you die, I want you to know the complete truth about your precious Mary. She didn't die quickly like I told you before. She lived for 3 days after the stagecoach attack, chained in a cave much like this one. She called out your name, constantly begging you to save her. But you weren't there, were you? You let her travel alone, and she died because of your failure as a husband." Clara stepped forward, positioning herself between Pike and Jonah. "You're lying," she said firmly. "You're trying to break him with words because you've lost control of the situation. Have I?" Pike smiled, but there was madness in his eyes now. "Look around you. You're trapped in a cave with no way out, and I have the only weapons. Nothing has changed except the location of your deaths." But something had changed. During Pike's speech, Jonah had noticed something crucial about the cavern they were in. The ceiling was supported by old wooden beams, probably installed by miners years ago, when this had been a working claim. The wood was rotting and unstable, held in place more by habit than by structural integrity. "Clara," Jonah said quietly, his voice barely audible above the sound of dripping water. "When I give the signal, dive to the left." She nodded slightly, understanding that he had a plan, even if she couldn't see what it was. Pike raised his revolvers, his fingers tightening on the triggers. "Any last words before I send you to join your wife?" Instead of answering, Jonah grabbed a heavy rock from the cavern floor and hurled it with all his strength at the nearest support beam. The rotting wood splintered on impact, and the ceiling began to sag ominously. Dust and small stones rained down on them as the ancient timbers creaked under the strain. "You fool," Pike shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "You'll bring the whole mountain down on us." "Maybe," Jonah replied, grabbing another rock despite the pain in his wounded leg. "But at least we'll die free men." He threw the second rock, and another beam cracked with a sound like breaking bones. The ceiling began to collapse in earnest, now sending huge chunks of stone crashing down around them. Pike fired his revolvers wildly, but the falling rocks made accurate shooting impossible. Clara grabbed Jonah's arm and pulled him toward a narrow crevice in the cavern wall that he hadn't noticed before. This way. She shouted over the sound of the collapse, her voice barely audible above the rumbling stone. They squeezed through the opening just as the main chamber behind them filled with tons of falling rock. Pike's screams were cut short as the mountain claimed him, burying him under the weight of his own evil. The sound of the collapse echoed through the tunnels for what seemed like hours, followed by a silence that was somehow more terrifying than the noise. The crevice led to a narrow tunnel that eventually opened onto a ledge halfway up the mountain's exterior. They emerged into the storm, battered and bleeding, but alive. Rain washed the dust from their faces and the blood from their wounds, while lightning illuminated the chaos below them. Pike's compound was in complete disorder. His men ran back and forth like ants from a disturbed nest, trying to figure out what had happened to their leader. Some were already loading horses and wagons, preparing to abandon the stronghold now that Pike was dead. Others stood around in confusion, uncertain what to do without orders. "We need to get away from here," Clara said, wiping blood from a cut on her forehead. "When they realize Pike is dead, they'll come looking for us. Some of them might blame us for destroying their livelihood." They climbed higher up the mountain, using the storm as cover, while their enemies searched the ruins below. The rain washed away their tracks, and the lightning made it impossible for Pike's men to follow them in the darkness. By morning, they had reached the far side of the mountain and were making their way back toward civilization. But their ordeal was far from over. Pike's men would soon discover their leader's death, and they would want revenge. Moreover, Jonah still hadn't found the proof he needed to expose Pike's entire criminal organization. The battle might be won, but the war was far from over. As they walked through the wilderness, their clothes soaked and their bodies aching, Clara suddenly stopped and turned to Jonah. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Something I couldn't say while Pike was alive." "What is it?" Clara took a deep breath, as if gathering courage for what she was about to reveal. "I lied about never seeing your wife. I did see her, but not in the way you think. Pike showed me her photograph once, along with the photographs of all his other victims. He keeps them in a special album in his private quarters." Jonah felt his heart stop. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Pike lied to you about Mary's death. The photograph wasn't of a dead woman, Jonah. It was of someone very much alive." The words hit him like a physical blow. For 2 years he had grieved for Mary, believing she was dead. Now to learn that she might be alive, but suffering as Pike's prisoner, was almost more than he could bear. The silver locket around Clara's neck suddenly felt heavier, as if it carried the weight of all his hopes and fears. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Clara replied, "but I know how to find her." Falling action. The revelation that Mary might still be alive transformed Jonah's grief into something far more powerful. A desperate hope mixed with righteous fury. As they made their way back to Pike's compound under cover of darkness, every step felt like both a journey toward salvation and a march toward damnation. Most of Pike's men had fled after discovering the collapsed tunnel and their leader's presumed death, but a few remained behind to salvage what they could from the operation. Clara led Jonah to Pike's private quarters, a luxurious cabin that stood in stark contrast to the crude barracks where his men lived. Inside, they found Pike's personal records, meticulously kept ledgers that detailed every crime he had committed, every person he had killed or captured, every piece of stolen property in his possession. The man had been obsessively organized, treating his criminal activities with the same attention to detail that a legitimate businessman might give to his accounts. Among the papers, Clara found what she was looking for: a hand-drawn map showing the location of Pike's most secret prison, a hidden cave system about 20 miles from the main compound. The map was annotated in Pike's careful handwriting with notes about guard rotations, supply runs, and the number of prisoners held at each location. "This is where he keeps the women he doesn't want to sell." Clara explained, her finger tracing the route on the map. "The ones he saves for his own purposes, or the ones he's keeping for special reasons." Jonah studied the map, memorizing every detail. The route would take them through some of the most dangerous terrain in the territory, but he would have crawled through hell itself for the chance to find Mary. How many prisoners are there? I don't know for certain, but I've overheard the guards talking about it. Maybe a dozen women, some of them held for years. They're kept in conditions that make our cells look comfortable. As they gathered supplies from the abandoned compound, weapons, food horses, and medical supplies, Clara made a discovery that chilled them both. In Pike's desk, she found a letter dated just 3 days earlier, addressed to a man named Colonel Harrison in the territorial capital. The letter revealed that Pike had been selling information about gold shipments and military movements to Confederate sympathizers, helping them plan attacks on Union supply lines. Pike wasn't just a common criminal, he was a traitor who had been working with enemy agents throughout the Civil War. "We have to get this to the authorities," Clara said, holding up the letter. "This proves Pike was part of a much larger conspiracy." "After we find Mary," Jonah replied firmly. "Nothing else matters until she's safe." They rode through the night, following the map toward Pike's secret prison. The route took them through treacherous mountain passes and hidden valleys that would have been impossible to navigate without Pike's detailed directions. The terrain was so difficult that they had to dismount frequently and lead their horses over rocky sections that could have broken an animal's leg. As dawn broke over the mountains, they reached the entrance to the cave system. It was hidden behind a waterfall, accessible only by a narrow ledge that forced them to leave their horses behind. The sound of rushing water would mask any noise they made, but it would also prevent them from hearing approaching guards. Clara led the way, having made this journey once before, when Pike had brought her here as an object lesson about what happened to prisoners who tried to escape. The caves were a natural labyrinth carved by thousands of years of flowing water into a maze of tunnels and chambers. They moved carefully through the underground passages, avoiding the areas where Pike's guards might be stationed. Most of the men had probably fled after news of Pike's death reached them, but some might have remained to guard the prisoners or to claim the more valuable captives for themselves. In the deepest part of the cave system, they found the prison cells. The conditions were even worse than Clara had described, and the cells were carved into the living rock, each one barely large enough for a person to lie down, with no sanitation facilities and only the most basic provisions for survival. In the last cell behind bars that were more rust than metal, they found Mary McCall. She was almost unrecognizable. 2 years of captivity had aged her beyond her 28 years, turning her once auburn hair prematurely gray and etching lines of suffering into her face. Her clothes were little more than rags, and her body bore the scars of countless beatings and worse. But her eyes were still bright with the intelligence and determination that Jonah had fallen in love with. And when she saw him, her face transformed with a mixture of joy and disbelief. "Aunt Jonah," she whispered as if afraid she was dreaming. "Is it really you?" "I'm here," he said, tears streaming down his face as he worked to break the ancient lock on her cell. "I'm here, and I'm taking you home." The lock was more rust than metal, and it broke apart under the pressure of a heavy rock. Mary collapsed into his arms, sobbing with relief and exhaustion. Her body was frighteningly light, as if she were made of nothing but skin and bones. "I knew you would come," she said, her voice weak but filled with love. "I knew you wouldn't give up on me." They freed the other prisoners, 11 women ranging in age, from teenagers to elderly, all of them victims of Pike's network of cruelty. Some were coherent enough to walk on their own, while others had to be carried by their stronger companions. Clara organized them into a group, assigning the healthier women to help those who were too weak to manage alone. As they prepared to leave the caves, Mary grabbed Jonah's arm with surprising strength. "There's something you need to know," she said urgently. "Pike didn't just keep us here as prisoners. He was using us as leverage against our families, forcing them to cooperate with his criminal activities." "What kind of activities?" "He was building a network of informants throughout the territory. Businessmen, politicians, even some lawmen, anyone who had family members he could threaten. He controlled them through fear, making them give him information about gold shipments, military movements, and law enforcement activities. Jonah realized the full scope of Pike's conspiracy. It wasn't just about robbery and murder. It was about controlling the entire territory through a web of blackmail and terror. The man had been building an empire of fear with himself as the absolute ruler. They made their way out of the caves as quickly as possible, knowing that other members of Pike's organization might still be searching for them. The rescued prisoners were weak and traumatized, but they were alive, and that was what mattered most. As they reached the outside world, Jonah looked back at the hidden cave system one final time. Pike's reign of terror was over, but the damage he had done would take years to heal. Families had been destroyed, lives had been ruined, and trust in law and order had been shattered throughout the territory. But justice had been served, and the innocent had been freed. It was a beginning, not an ending. And Jonah knew that the real work of healing was just starting. Resolution and final surprise. 3 weeks later, Jonah, Mary, and Clara arrived in Sundown Gulch with the rescued prisoners and Pike's incriminating documents. The town was in chaos as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Several prominent citizens were arrested as unwilling collaborators, including Mayor Harrison and Sheriff Dobbs, who had been feeding information to Pike's organization in exchange for their family's safety. The territorial governor dispatched a team of federal marshals to investigate the corruption, and within a month, most of Pike's remaining gang members had been captured or killed. The bride auctions were shut down permanently, and new laws were passed to prevent such horrors from happening again. Mary's recovery was slow and painful. The physical wounds healed relatively quickly under the care of the town's doctor, but the psychological scars would take much longer to fade. She suffered from nightmares that left her screaming in the night, and sudden noises could send her into a panic that lasted for hours. But with Jonah's patient support and Clara's understanding friendship, she gradually began to return to something resembling normal life. Clara chose to stay with them, becoming like a sister to Mary and a trusted friend to Jonah. She had no other family left alive, and the three of them had formed a bond that couldn't be broken by conventional social expectations. Together, they decided to start a new life in a different town far from the memories of Pike's terror. The townspeople of Sundown Gulch were grateful for their role in exposing the corruption and bringing Pike's reign of terror to an end. They took up a collection to help the three of them get established elsewhere, with local businesses donating supplies and the bank providing a small loan to help them purchase land. They settled in a fertile valley, about 100 miles south of Sundown Gulch, where Jonah used his mining expertise to establish a new claim. This time, however, he was more careful about security and more selective about who he trusted. The trauma of losing Mary once had taught him to value safety over profit. Mary slowly regained her strength and began to help with the mining operation, using her sharp mind for mathematics to keep the books and manage the business side of their growing enterprise. Clara proved to have a natural talent for negotiating with suppliers and customers, and she became the public face of their operation, while Jonah focused on the technical aspects of mining. 6 months after Pike's death, they received word that Colonel Harrison, the Confederate agent mentioned in Pike's letters, had been captured in St. Louis and was providing information about other rebel networks throughout the territory. The federal government was so grateful for the intelligence that they awarded Jonah and Clara a substantial reward for their service to the Union cause. The money allowed them to expand their mining operation and hire additional workers. More importantly, it gave them the resources to help other victims of Pike's organization. They established a fund to provide medical care and financial assistance to the women who had been trafficked, and they worked with church groups to help them find new homes and rebuild their lives. As their first year in the new location drew to a close, Jonah and Mary began to talk about starting the family they had always wanted. The experience of losing each other had taught them not to take their time together for granted, and they were eager to build something positive from the ashes of their trauma. Clara, meanwhile, had begun corresponding with a young doctor named Thomas Mitchell, who had treated some of the rescued prisoners. He was impressed by her strength and intelligence, and they were making plans for him to visit their valley in the spring. The prospect of love and marriage seemed like a distant dream after everything she had endured, but Clara was beginning to believe that healing was possible. On a cold December evening, as they sat around the fire in their new log cabin, Mary made an announcement that surprised them all. "I've been thinking about Pike's treasure," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "The gold and jewelry he stole from his victims over the years. Most of it was never recovered from his compound." "What about it?" Jonah asked, looking up from the mining reports he had been studying. "Well, I remember where he kept his main strongbox. It was hidden in a cave behind his private quarters, sealed with a combination lock. I saw him open it once when he was showing off his collection to some visiting criminals." Clara sat up straighter, her interest clearly piqued. "Do you remember the combination?" "I think so. It was the date of his first successful robbery, the one that started his career as an outlaw. He was proud of it, and he used the same numbers for all his locks." The three of them looked at each other, realizing what this meant. Pike's treasure represented not just wealth, but justice for his victims. The gold and jewelry could be returned to families who had lost everything, and the money could fund efforts to prevent similar tragedies in the future. "We'll go back in the spring," Jonah decided. "When the weather's better and we can travel safely. We'll recover what we can and make sure it gets to the right people." Mary nodded, her eyes bright with purpose. It's what Pike would have hated most, his stolen treasure being used to help the people he tried to destroy. As they made plans for the return trip, none of them noticed the letter that had arrived that afternoon, mixed in with the regular mail. It was addressed to Clara, and the return address showed it was from a law firm in St. Louis. The letter contained news that would change everything once again. Clara's uncle, whom she had believed dead for years, was actually alive and had been searching for her throughout the war. He had built a successful shipping business in St. Louis and was prepared to provide her with a substantial inheritance, enough to make her independently wealthy. But that discovery would come later. For now the three of them were content to sit by the fire, planning their future and grateful for the simple miracle of being alive and together. They had survived Pike's evil, exposed his conspiracy, and found a way to build something good from the wreckage of their lives. Outside, snow began to fall, covering the valley in a blanket of white that seemed to symbolize the fresh start they had all earned. The nightmare was over. The truth had been revealed, and justice had been served. For the first time in years, they could look forward to tomorrow without fear. In the end, Pike Morrison's greatest failure wasn't that he had been defeated by his enemies, it was that he had brought them together. His cruelty had forged unbreakable bonds between three people who might never have met otherwise. And his evil had inspired them to create something beautiful and lasting. The silver locket still hung around Clara's neck, but now it represented hope rather than loss. Mary had given it to her as a symbol of their friendship and shared survival, and Clara wore it proudly as a reminder that even in the darkest times, love and loyalty could triumph over hatred and fear. As the fire died down and they prepared for bed, Jonah looked at his wife and his friend and realized that he was perhaps the luckiest man in the territory. He had lost everything and found it again, plus something more valuable than gold, and the knowledge that some bonds were stronger than death itself. The story of Pike Morrison's reign of terror had ended. But the story of the three people who survived it was just beginning. And that story, Jonah knew, would have a much happier ending than anything Pike could have imagined.